I'm Ros Atkins. Welcome to Outside Source. Let's start in England. Hallelujah, said some MPs. Some people are clearly very happy. The government's announced the timeline for pubs and restaurants to reopen. But despite that and a number of other relaxations, the chief scientific officer has still urged caution.
The disease is growing across the world. It's coming down in the UK, but it hasn't gone away.
Of Rayshard Brooks, who was shot dead as he fled police officers, has taken place in Atlanta.
What do you do to stay alive? Comply like George Floyd or run like Rayshard Brooks? I'm not asking for a friend, I'm asking for myself.
Also in the US, the top health official, Dr. Anthony Fauci, has contradicted President Trump's claims on testing for COVID-19. But we're going to begin this edition of the programme with a big moment, no doubt, for those of you watching in England, because there's been another significant shift in the COVID-19 restrictions. Here's the Prime Minister earlier.
Mr. Speaker, I can tell the House that we will also reopen restaurants and pubs.
Hallelujah.
So, pubs and restaurants in England will be reopening from the 4th of July. That's part of a broader range of changes. Here's Jonathan Blake with the lowdown.
Cinemas, hair salons and pubs will be able to reopen in England on the 4th of July, providing safety measures are in place. And the current 2-metre social distancing requirement is being reduced to 1 metre, allowing venues to open. There are currently no plans for similar changes in Scotland and Wales, while in Northern Ireland the distance has already been cut for school children.
Now, of course, the central question here is whether the easing of restrictions risks a rise in the infection rate. Here's the BBC's health correspondent, Dominic Hughes.
For weeks now, we've been urged to maintain a distance of 2 metres. At the height of the pandemic, with the coronavirus circulating widely, it was argued keeping 2 metres away from others reduced the risk of infection. So what's happened to alter that advice?
The science actually hasn't changed. What's changed is the absolute numbers of cases in the community. So 2 metres is still going to be safer than 1 metre. But if there's no virus in your community, then the risk is zero. If there's no virus, you can't catch it. So it's not that the science has changed, it's just that the balance of risk has changed.
Staying safe from the virus involves several different factors, most obviously distance. Being 1 metre apart can be up to 10 times riskier than being 2 metres apart. But timing is also important. Spending more than 15 minutes close together will increase the chances of infection, as does being face-to-face, which can be as risky 2 metres apart as it is being back-to-back with someone at 1 metre. But the government in England, at least, believes some of this risk can be mitigated, reduced by measures such as screens at tills or table service in pubs. But there are those who believe this is all happening far too soon.
It sounds all right if you're out of doors and you do keep that 1 metre distance apart. But if you're indoors, you're at a much greater risk because you're sitting in proximity to other people. You're not wearing masks if you're in restaurants and pubs. And the level of viral infection in the air could well be quite high.
Well, to explore the political pressures behind the UK government's decision, here's Rob Watson.
I think if there was a government minister sitting here, if Mr Johnson was sitting here, I think the government would say, look, what we're doing is we're responding to the fact that the level of virus in the UK society, well, particularly England, we're focusing on England, is low enough to take these measures. But I mean, have there been political pressures? Of course there have. There's no doubt that many Conservative politicians from the governing Conservative Party really keen for the economy to be opening up. And on the specifics of the distancing, getting that down from 2 metres to 1 metre, I don't think there's any doubt there's been a lot of lobbying from businesses, particularly in the hospitality sector, saying, hey, look, we can't, it's lovely to be open again, but if it's at 2 metres, we can't run a pub or a restaurant or a whatever that way. So I think it's been a whole mix of things, the virus coming down, but you betcha political and lobbying pressure too.
Now, the daily number of people dying from the coronavirus is falling in the UK, but the overall total remains one of the highest in the world. In the last 24 hours, the government tells us 171 people have died from COVID-19 in the UK. The government also announced another 109 deaths that occurred in April, May and June. That takes the overall total in the UK to close to 43,000. Well, today was the last of the daily press briefings from the UK government. That means we're going to see a lot less of people like the Chief Medical Officer, Chris Whitty, as a result. Here's some of his message today.
We are going to be living with this virus for a very long time. If we have to wait until natural immunity finally gets on top of this, we're talking about a very long period. Obviously, we all hope a vaccine will come earlier. So what might change over time? It'll include the epidemiology, and what goes down can go up. Winter, for example, may change that. It might mean that we actually have to increase some of the measures. Equally, it may be that the epidemiology gets better over time, continues the current downward trend, and we could go downwards.
Now, some people have been saying with these daily briefings stopping, will that affect the scrutiny which is brought to bear on the UK government and its decisions? Here's Rob Watson on that.
To be a little bit frivolous for a second, I suspect that certain media organisations and politicians will be rather relieved that they don't have this daily fixture at 5 p.m. UK time. I'm pretty sure that scrutiny will go on in one form or another. After all, politicians are they're not exactly able to hide from us journalists. I mean, I don't know whether it's going to be as easy to question the scientists. I know the scientists themselves find this sort of format where you get fired questions at by people like you and me, not their normal style of doing things. But I guess we'll wait and see. On a less frivolous point, it was interesting. You played a little clip of Chris Whitty there. One of the interesting things I think that people like him are worried about, that abandoning things like the daily briefing will sort of lull people in the UK into a sort of false sense of security. Oh, well, pubs and restaurants are opening, all sorts of things are opening. There isn't that daily news conference anymore. Maybe we don't have to wash our hands so much. So I think that is the concern of the scientific community, even if they will be rather relieved not to have to face the likes of you and me.
Now, while lots of things are changing, one thing that isn't is that the majority of children in England will not be going to school till September at the earliest. Pippa Creran from the Mirror picked up on this, tweeting earlier. It's worth noting the Prime Minister has set up a task force for reopening bowling alleys, but still hasn't set one up for schools. Of course, Boris Johnson would say the decisions being taken around England's schools are being driven by the scientific advice that he's being given. Meanwhile, Scotland has announced that pupils will be able to return to schools in August if the virus continues to be suppressed. Let's hear from Scotland's Education Secretary. This is John Swinney.
There are now only 2,000 infectious people in Scotland, a reduction of around 90% since May. There has been a sustained downward trend in COVID-19 deaths. Intensive care cases now stand at a fraction of what they were. If we stay on this trajectory, which cannot be taken for granted, by August, the position will be even better. That is good news. That means we are now able to update our planning assumptions. If we stay on track, if we all continue to do what is right, and if we can further suppress this terrible virus, the government believes that we should prepare for children to be able to return to school full-time in August.
Well, in addition to COVID-19, the UK has also had to deal with its upcoming departure from the European Union. Here's Rob on those twin pressures on the UK government.
If you had to pick a government in the European Union, in Europe, that was facing some pretty tough challenges, it's the UK government. It's partly in the first place because the kind of economy that the UK has, we Brits, we love to go out, eat, drink, shop, and have a good time, and so it's a very heavy service economy. So that the COVID-19 challenge has really harmed the sort of essence, if you like, of the UK economy, and of course still to be done is Britain's separation from the European Union, because although we left the EU in January, of course, we're still in a transition period, so we're still in the single market, the customs union. So it's got a huge amount on its plate, and of course something else that it's facing is plummeting. Plummeting is probably a strong word. Its approval rating has dropped a lot, the government, since the start of the crisis. I think it was at 52% and it's now down to 32%. So the government, I think, Ros, is going to be hoping that one thing definitely happens, that is that the business bounces back, and that a second thing definitely doesn't happen, that's the rate of infections and the rate of COVID cases going up again.
And if you need further information on the changes in the rules in England and indeed across the UK, you can find that on the BBC News website. Now we switch to the US because the funeral of Rayshard Brooks has just finished in Atlanta, Georgia. These are some pictures from earlier of mourners arriving at the service. It took place inside the Ebenezer Baptist Church. Mr. Brooks was shot dead while fleeing a police officer in a car park earlier this month. He was black. The now former officer who shot him is white and is now being charged with murder. The shooting generated a lot of coverage, more than it normally would, frankly, because it happened not long after George Floyd was killed in custody in Minneapolis, which, as you'll know, led to a wave of anti-racism protests in the US and elsewhere. While the eulogy at the service was read by the Reverend Raphael Warnock, here's some of what he said.
George Floyd complied. Rayshard Brooks ran. Yes, that's true. But they are both dead. And therein is the problem. Black parents do not really know what to tell their children in order to keep them alive, and that's a problem. That's not just a black problem, although it's happening to black people. That's an American problem.
While the BBC's Nelly Torfik was following the funeral from New York.
Well, yeah, we heard a lot there from Reverend Warnock in the eulogy, basically saying that this country has grown too accustomed to black people dying. He said that Rayshard Brooks is just the latest high-profile casualty in the struggle for justice and the battle for the soul of America, really of the virus of racism, he says. And he really urged people to go out and vote on November 3rd. He said it's not just enough to march in the streets, you have to march to the voting booth. But this was a very symbolic location, the Ebenezer Baptist Church. This is where the civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr. preached until he was assassinated. He was a co-pastor there. And so his daughter, the youngest, Reverend Dr. Bernice King, also spoke at the service, again urging people to continue protesting, saying to do it until all Black lives matter in the country. And she spoke very emotionally, reaching out to the children of Rayshard Brooks, his 4 children, including his youngest, who was sitting on her mother's lap, saying she remembered being 5 years old and the national attention on the death of her father, speaking about how this is a moment for the nation to really finally try to heal, to use this momentum to address a long-standing problem of racial tensions in this country. She said this great tragedy in the nation must seize that humanity and democracy are on trial. Justice and equity have eluded an entire race of people. So a very strong ceremony here, filled with a video tribute to Rayshard Brooks, family members speaking on his behalf, speaking about him as a person, how he would walk around in cowboy boots, how he would pretend that he was a good dancer. So a lot of emotional tributes for him and his family, but a larger message here about the need to combat police brutality and racial tensions in this country.
In a few minutes, we're going to be going back to the US because a top health official there, Dr. Anthony Fauci, has directly contradicted what President Trump has been saying about the benefits or otherwise of testing for COVID-19. Let's turn back to the UK now. In Northern Ireland, more changes have come into force with regards to COVID-19. Here's Emma Vardy.
There's been a significant change for people's social lives here in Northern Ireland, as now up to 6 people from different households can meet up indoors, Northern Ireland being the first part of the UK to permit this. But you might need a rather large living room though, because the 2-metre social distancing rule will still apply. The Stormont executive has also strongly advised people to wear masks if they are meeting up indoors. And in these circumstances, there's still no overnight stays permitted, and still a very cautious approach advised for people who are shielding. This latest change of 6 people meeting indoors doesn't apply to people shielding, but there is a planned pause in shielding further down the line, expected on July the 31st. And as to whether the 2-metre social distancing rule will reduce to 1 metre as England has done, Northern Ireland's still yet to decide this.
I'm Will Atkins with Outside Source. As usual in the BBC Newsroom, our lead story comes from the UK. There's going to be a significant relaxation of the coronavirus lockdown rules in England from next month. Pubs, hotels, hairdressers and cinemas can all reopen. Well, let's have a look through some of the main stories from BBC World Service. Beginning in Mexico, its president is saying one person has died after a powerful earthquake shook buildings and caused panic in 6 Mexican states, along with the capital, Mexico City. Many people were working from home as the capital is still under lockdown for COVID-19. Now, let's talk about Dr. Anthony Fauci. You'll know him, the Trump administration's top coronavirus advisor. Well, he's directly contradicted President Trump today on the issue of testing for COVID-19. He's also said some parts of the US are seeing a disturbing surge in infections. Before anything else, let's just go through the figures in America. COVID-19's killed 120,000 people. There are more than 2.3 million cases. In more than half the states, the number of new cases is still rising. You can see that in the South and the West that's happening, particularly in states which loosened their restrictions early on. Texas, for example, recorded its biggest number of new cases on Saturday, and the number of people in hospital with the virus has risen for 11 consecutive days. California's infection rate has been surging through the last week. The number of people in hospital there has surpassed the peak in April. And then there's Florida. It's seeing cases rise sharply. It's now the 7th state to reach 100,000 cases. Bear all of that in mind as we turn to this issue of testing. First of all, here's Dr. Fauci.
A couple of days ago, there were 30,000 new infections. That's very troublesome to me. The way you address that, and I've said this over and over again, is you have to have the manpower, the system, the testing to identify, isolate, and contact trace in an effective way so that when you see those increases, you can understand where they're coming from and you can do something about them.
So let's compare that with this. Here's the president tweeting, "Cases are going up in the US because we're testing far more than any other country and ever expanding. With smaller testing, we would show fewer cases." Now, of course, the main driver of America's numbers is not the testing, it's the fact that lots of people have COVID-19. And that tweet follows on from Saturday.
When you do testing to that extent, you're going to find more people, you're going to find more cases. So I said to my people, slow the testing down, please.
Well, the president's press secretary, when asked about that, said it was a joke. But then the president said this today.
I don't kid. Let me just tell you, let me make it clear. We have got the greatest testing program anywhere in the world. Testing is a double-edged sword. In one way, it tells you you have cases. In another way, you find out where the cases are, and you do a good job. We are doing a great job. We have never been credited for it.
There's the president saying he's making things clear, all of which led to Dr. Fauci being asked about the idea of slowing up the testing.
I know for sure, but to my knowledge, none of us have ever been told to slow down on testing. That just is a fact. In fact, we will be doing more testing.
And if you're still with me, here's the president tweeting since that statement from Dr. Fauci saying, "We did a great job on the virus. We saved millions of US lives." He goes on to describe Dr. Anthony Fauci as with us in all ways. But these guys have history. President Trump called advice from Dr. Fauci in May unacceptable. In June, when Dr. Fauci said that resuming American football games may be impossible, the president tweeted, "Tony Fauci has nothing to do with NFL football." Well, to try and help us through all of this, here's Barbara Plett-Usher in Washington on what else health officials have been saying today.
They said it's an uneven picture across the United States. It's a massive country, and the level of coronavirus infections is different in different parts. And so you have, on the one hand, some bright spots like New York, where the number of cases has gone down. But then you have those other areas that Dr. Fauci said were troubling or disturbing with surges. He mentioned Texas and Florida and Arizona, but there are also other states. In fact, the coronavirus cases are increasing in about half of American states right now. And that is for various reasons, but one of them is because the way those states have reopened is also sort of uneven. There have been guidelines from the Center for Disease Control about how the states should reopen, but they're not mandated. mandatory, and different governors have taken different approaches. In some cases, they have opened before they've met those guidelines, and now it seems we're seeing the results of that. In fact, Dr. Fauci said one of the reasons for the increase in coronavirus cases was not necessarily because of the extra testing, but because of community transmission. And he said the next couple of weeks would be critical in determining how they would be able to deal with that sort of surge. So yes, we saw the picture, a very mixed picture, a mixed bag, as Dr. Fauci called it.
And I don't mean to be flippant when I ask this next question, Barbara, but to what degree do the president's utterances on this matter? You talk about a mixed bag. To what degree is that really dictated by how the states act rather than what the president says?
I think what the president does is the most important thing. And the bottom line, Roz, is that he has not modeled the guidelines that the Center for Disease Control has put out. He is not wearing a mask. He's consistently refused to wear a mask so far. And also, he has definitely pivoted from the pandemic to the re-election. So he plays down the threat of the pandemic, and he plays up what he says is the success of the reopening. And those people who want to hear that message feel empowered to act on it. And those people who don't want to follow the guidelines that strictly, or who feel in their own experience that they don't think it's that much of a threat, do not feel pressured to take action. So I think his actions speak the loudest.
Well, let's stay in the Americas. Have a look at this graph. It shows new coronavirus cases, and you can see the US there marked in red, and there's Brazil in purple. Brazil has the second highest total of cases in the world, over 1 million, and over 50,000 people have died. Well, these are some of the latest pictures to come into us. These are aerial pictures of a cemetery in Manaus in the north of Brazil, which has been particularly badly affected. This is a private hospital in the city of Niterói, just near to Rio de Janeiro. It's turned into a coronavirus ICU, as you can see. Another development in Brazil is that a judge has ordered President Bolsonaro to wear a protective mask when he's in public spaces. Now, much like his hero, President Trump, as you can see, Mr. Bolsonaro is not keen on wearing masks. At one rally, he was filmed coughing without covering his mouth. On another occasion, he sneezed into his hand and then shook the hand of an elderly woman immediately afterwards, which, frankly, virus or no virus, isn't ideal. The judge said if the president and other public officials do not comply with the requirement to wear a mask in public, they'll be fined close to $400 US. And you don't imagine the prospect of that's going to bother the president one bit. Well, another COVID-19 story to talk about. Novak Djokovic has tested positive for the virus. He's the world #1 men's tennis player, and he's been apologising. That's because it's likely he caught the virus at a tournament he'd organised in Serbia and Croatia. The idea was to help players get back to match fitness. They haven't been playing very much because of the pandemic. Evidently, the idea wasn't to see several of the players get the virus. He says, "I'm so deeply sorry our tournament has caused harm. Everything the organisers and I did, we did with a pure heart and sincere intentions." The tournament didn't even finish. It was scrapped yesterday after 3 other players tested positive. You may have seen these images from the event. No social distancing among the players, and the stands were packed with spectators. And these pictures also emerged on social media of Djokovic partying last week with other tennis players and his wife during the Belgrade leg of this tour. Well, here's BBC Serbian's Aleksandar Miladinovic in Belgrade.
It is hard to say there's any social distancing in Belgrade, famous nightlife. The players enjoyed it during the night, during the day. They enjoyed having photos with a lot of fans that were around tennis courts, both in Belgrade and in Croatia. The rules in Serbia have changed swiftly in about a month ago. From almost a complete lockdown, we went to almost absolute freedom. So I guess many people were confused even at that time. What were they supposed to be doing during nightlife?
Now, after the positive test, Djokovic put out an initial statement in which he said, "We organised the tournament when the virus has weakened, believing the conditions for hosting the tour had been met. Unfortunately, this virus is still present, and it's a new reality we are learning to live with." And yes, of course, unfortunately, the virus is still present, something most people worked out without the help of hosting a tennis tournament, but Djokovic got there in the end. He has some form on this. Earlier during the pandemic, he said on COVID-19, "Personally, I'm opposed to vaccination." He's also said, "Scientists have proven that in an experiment, molecules in water react to our emotions to what have been said. Now, I'm not going to open that can of worms. You might be familiar with those claims, but it's fair to say Djokovic is not always with the majority of scientists. Here's the BBC's tennis correspondent, Russell Fuller.
I think everybody wishes Novak Djokovic well, and his wife Jelena, who's also tested positive. Their children returned negative tests, and the other players that were affected over the course of the past couple of weekends. But there's just been bewilderment within tennis circles ever since the first leg of this Adria Tour took place in Belgrade the weekend before this last one, that tennis, whatever the rules might say in that part of the world, and a tournament went ahead without any social distancing in place at all. Nick Kyrgios, the Australian, was very outspoken yesterday, saying it was a boneheaded decision to go ahead with it and abandon all social distancing. And a lot of people just not surprised, really, that Djokovic has announced this positive test, because the players were in very, very close proximity to each other. They played a friendly game of basketball, football, they went dancing in a nightclub, there were high fives, there were handshakes, there were hugs. They were carrying on, in short, as if it was still 2019.
Now, in a few minutes, we're going to talk about who Joe Biden might pick as his running mate. See you then.
Good evening. Our forecast for the next few days is all about the heat, building heat day on day until it gets hot enough to go pop. And that looks like it's going to be Friday when we see thunderstorms breaking out. But in the next few days, for some of us, talking about temperatures into the low 30s. The heat spreading north from Spain across France into the UK. The most widespread heat on Thursday, and then for the end of the week, some thunderstorms pushing in, helping to ease the heat, and then we move into cooler, fresher air for the weekend and a more unsettled weather regime. But for the next few days, as I said, it is all about those temperatures pushing up. Through this evening and overnight, we have clear skies for England and Wales. A weather front still sitting across Scotland and Northern Ireland, bringing some further outbreaks of rain here. Rather murky around some of the Irish sea coasts as well. Lows in the north, 13 and 14 degrees, perhaps no lower than 16 in central London. For Wednesday daytime, that front's still around to the northwest, but all the while this high is trying to push it away and weakening it too. So we should see more sunshine on Wednesday for southern and eastern Scotland. Still some rain in the west early on, still some rain for Northern Ireland, but as that front fades during the course of the day, I think for the afternoon it will just be a case of lingering cloud for many. A lot of sunshine again for England and Wales, and a lot of heat. In some spots, 31, 32 degrees Celsius possible, up to 22 with some sunshine across eastern Scotland. And then Thursday, likely to be the hottest day in general across the UK as a whole. Some thunderstorms possible across northern Scotland as the heat pushes its way north. Higher temperatures certainly for the central belt of Scotland, for example, on Thursday, up to 27, 23 in Northern Ireland, never quite as hot here, but 32 or 33 possible somewhere across central or eastern England. Then, as promised though, we start to see low pressures starting to try and take hold once again. And on Friday, it all starts to go bang. I think there will be some pretty dramatic thunderstorms pushing from west to east through the course of the day. Saturday, a cooler, fresher story. And on into the weekend, we keep a rather more unsettled weather regime with, yes, some sunny spells, but some showers at times, but definitely feeling cooler.
Never miss a story. Get the headlines as they happen. And watch BBC News live wherever you are. Download the BBC News app.
How dare you, Greta Thunberg told world leaders in the UN. So how does it feel like to become a global figure? How does climate action connect with Black Lives Matter? Is coronavirus an opportunity, and why does she still have hope?
The Greta Thunberg interview, Saturday at 5:30 on the BBC News channel.
In these extraordinary times, Question Time doesn't have a studio audience, but that doesn't mean the debate stops. We're still taking questions from you, the viewers, and putting them to our political leaders and to the experts.
Join in the debate. Question Time, available to stream now on BBC iPlayer.
طيب عم بتصل بيك مشان الشغالة المحطوط على الإنترنت عندك.
When I come in quick, I look like an orphan, like a slave.
Our World is a unique series of films on the BBC, offering personal insights into global events.
Sería muy prudente que no firmáramos más.
Our World, stories that speak for themselves.
Hello, I'm Ros Atkins. Welcome back to Outside Source. Some MPs saying Alleluia after the government announced a timeline for pubs and restaurants to reopen in England. But despite this and a number of other relaxations, this is the caution we're hearing from the Chief Scientific Officer.
The disease is growing across the world. It's coming down in the UK, but it hasn't gone away.
In America, the funeral of Rayshard Brooks, who was shot dead as he fled police officers in Atlanta, has just finished.
What do you do to stay alive? Comply like George Floyd or run like Rayshard Brooks? I'm not asking for a friend, I'm asking for myself.
Also in the US, a top health official, Dr. Anthony Fauci, has directly contradicted President Trump's claims about the possibility of slowing down testing. Now, let's talk in detail about the US presidential election. It's in November, you'll know that. And while we know that the Democratic nominee is going to be Joe Biden, and we know that he'll be up against Donald Trump and his Vice President Mike Pence, we don't know who Joe Biden's running mate is going to be. Back in March, though, he did narrow the field a little by saying, "My running mate will be a woman." Though this hardly ranks as radical progress, we should also say this would be only the third time that one of the major US parties has selected a woman for the vice presidency. There are some reasons why Mr. Biden might think this was a good idea. One is the polls. This recent Fox News poll found Biden to be ahead of Trump by 12 points overall, but by 19 points when narrowed that down to women voters. It's thought a female running mate would support that trend. There's also some suggestion that picking a female running mate may insulate Biden from allegations that he engaged in unwanted physical contact with women, and the more serious accusation that from a former staffer, Tara Reid, that he sexually assaulted her. This article from Politico back in April addresses the issue, saying the allegations have rattled his VP search. They say the job description has suddenly become more complicated. They must now defend him against sexual assault accusations without looking hypocritical. Well, Anthony Zurcher is going to help me cast his eye over the options for Joe Biden. Since he made that statement saying he wanted to pick a woman as his running mate, COVID-19 has arrived in America, plus we've seen the demonstrations after the death of George Floyd. Have either of those two events affected his calculations?
It definitely has. He's still looking at about a dozen women, but there are a couple of names that have been on the upswing. One is Gretchen Whitmer, the governor of Michigan. She was put in the spotlight because of COVID-19 and her state's response to what was one of the hot spots at the time, instituting shelter-in-place orders and dealing with a lot of protests from conservatives about her attempts to do that, including Donald Trump himself. Another name is Keisha Lance Bottoms. She's the mayor of Atlanta. She's been dealing with the protests in her city. She's a black woman. She's spoken out very personally and passionately about what these demonstrations mean to her and how she's dealing with raising children, 4 children in a southern city during this time of enormous upswings of emotion. So I think those are two that probably weren't on anyone's radar last year. Now I think they're, if not among the top, in the upper half, I'd say.
OK, Anthony, let's look through some of the contenders, and there are quite a few, as you were saying. Anthony's written this excellent and highly comprehensive article on the BBC News website going through some of the contenders and their pros and cons as candidates. First, let's concentrate on Kamala Harris, widely considered to be the front-runner. She's a senator from California. She ran against Joe Biden for the presidential nomination. She didn't get that, Anthony. Does that in any way stand in her way, though?
Well, you know, I mean, there was a bit of a clash between Kamala Harris and Joe Biden in the first debate where Harris criticized Biden, but I think the fact that she has been on a national stage, that she was considered a front runner for the presidential nomination for a while and was subjected to that national scrutiny, that's something that a lot of the other contenders don't have. She comes from California, a big fundraising state. She's quick on her feet, and she also kind of ticks some of those diversity boxes. She's only the second black woman to ever serve in the U.S. Senate. She has a father who is from South Asia, and also she's younger than Joe Biden, which also helps a lot.
All right, next we have another person who ran against him for the presidential nomination, Elizabeth Warren, senator from Massachusetts. In fact, back in 2019, she led the polls in the race for the nomination. She didn't get it, but she remains a heavyweight, Anthony. What are the pros and cons of her as a running mate?
Well, what she has going for her is that she has bona fides with the left wing of the Democratic Party. Although there were some clashes between her and Bernie Sanders, and some of the Bernie Sanders supporters aren't big fans of hers now, she does represent kind of one of the emotional beating heart of the progressive wing. And if Biden brings her in, I think that solidifies his left flank and also gives him a lot of policy proposals that he can run on, because she ran as the I have a plan for that candidate. Of course, she is a white, she's in her 70s, so she doesn't diversify the party in a way that, say, a Kamala Harris might or a Keisha Lance Bottoms would. But she definitely, she has a lot of gravitas, and she is well liked within the party.
One other person I wanted to pick out is Tammy Duckworth, a junior senator from Illinois. She's the first Thai-American woman elected to Congress, as well as being the first double amputee woman elected to Congress. In 2018, she became the first woman to give birth while serving in the Senate as well. Before I read your article, I didn't know as much about her as I did about some of the other candidates. For people watching who've not encountered her before, introduce her to us, please.
Yeah, I mean, she is a candidate that when people start to learn more about her, she becomes very compelling. She lost both of her legs when her helicopter was shot down in the Iraq War. So she is a Purple Heart winner, a war veteran, a military hero, in addition to being a U.S. senator. As you mentioned, coming from the Thai background, she would be the first Asian American on a presidential ticket from a major party. So that would be quite a historic moment as well. Illinois, while it is not a battleground state per se, very Democratic, it is close to the Midwestern battleground states like Ohio and Michigan and Wisconsin, all very close by. So she could bring some of that Midwestern appeal, and it would be an interesting pick, one that a lot of people may not consider, but it wouldn't be a surprise to me if Biden picks her.
And finally, when does he have to decide by?
Well, he said he wants to decide by early August. You remember the Democratic National Convention was originally scheduled in July, so we would be talking about VP picks in earnest if it wasn't for the coronavirus and the fact that the National Convention got delayed to mid-August. You have to have a decision by that time. So I think Biden saying early August, that fits right. He wants to save this. He likes this speculation. It's good for him. And then when he rolls out his nominee, there's a lot of good press around it. And then that nominee can get out on the stump, assuming that people can campaign in person once he picks it. So I think he's saving this bullet for a time when it can have the most impact.
Anthony, we always appreciate your guidance. Thank you very much indeed. And those of you watching, if that's whet your appetite, you can read all of Anthony's analysis on the BBC News website right now. Now, stay with me here on Outside Source, because in a few minutes, we're going to look at the long-term health effects for those who've contracted COVID-19. The Scottish Government has announced that all children in Scotland will be back at school full-time from August if coronavirus cases continue to recede. Here's more from our Scotland correspondent, Lorna Gordon.
Let's give it one more shot.
Final few days of home lessons for 8-year-old Lewis before the Scottish school holidays start.
Exceptionally hard. It's, as I said, it's been one of the most difficult things I've ever done. It's not something you're used to, and it's not something that you're qualified to do. We're not teachers.
Winding. So that's enjoying.
Edinburgh City Council had offered Lewis and his brother just over 1 day a week of in-school teaching each next term. That's now set to change. Scotland's Education Secretary said children should be able to return to school full-time next term.
I must stress this is the aim that the government is now working towards. However, because it has to be achieved safely, it inevitably remains conditional and dependent upon ongoing scientific and health advice.
The Scottish Government had been coming under growing pressure from opposition parties and some parents as it became clear what the blended learning model planned for next term would mean in practice. Some children had been offered around a day a week in school, others 1 week in 3 in class. Scotland's largest teaching union said they need agreement on safety concerns like PPE and testing before schools can get fully back to normal.
We are certainly not opposing it for the sake of opposing it. We would like to be in a position where public health in Scotland can allow schools to reopen more fully. But we're quite guarded and we don't think simply because you announce it, it makes it a reality.
Andy and Angela today relieved their children will be returning to school full time. These plans, though, all dependent on infection rates remaining low.
I'm Ross Atkins with Outside Source. We're here in the BBC Newsroom. Our lead story is that there will be a significant relaxation of the coronavirus rules in England from next month. Pubs, hotels, hairdressers and cinemas are all going to be able to reopen. Well, earlier in the programme, we heard how the UK is easing its restrictions in different ways in Northern Ireland, Wales, Scotland and England. Some countries did that easing a little bit earlier, and now some are fearing they may be experiencing a second wave. In Germany, local lockdowns are being used after an outbreak linked to a meatpacking plant. Here's Damien McGuinness.
The exact district that's going to be locked down again is called Gütersloh. Now, about 1/3 of a million people live there, so it's quite a large district, and that's just one small part of this very large state of North Rhine-Westphalia. But it's a real step back for this area, really, because for the past few weeks, most measures have been lifted in Germany, so bars and restaurants are completely open. Life feels almost back to normal for most of the country. In this district now, for 1/3 of a million people, suddenly we're going to go back to the state we were a couple of months ago. Now, what that means in concrete details is that bars will be closed again, restaurants will only be able to serve food to go. It means that all gyms, swimming pools, saunas, all sorts of sports facilities, restaurants, museums will all be closed. Now, this is quite drastic, and it does mean a big imposition and a big step back for people. And I think it does point to a broader issue, really, because this was one localised outbreak, which so far officials say has still been contained. It was around a meat processing plant where more than 1,500 workers have tested positive. The premier, the state premier of this region, says that so far there's no evidence that that outbreak has spread further. But what it does show is that in order to contain these outbreaks, you have to put forward some quite drastic measures which do, in fact, affect whole regions.
Well, next we turn to South Korea. Officials there say they're dealing with certainly an outbreak. Some are describing it as a second wave. We're told infections have been rising since a public holiday in May. But the context here is all important. Compared to countries like the US and the UK, South Korea has been far more successful at containing the virus in the first place, and it did so with an extensive track and trace programme, something neither the UK or the US did initially. Here's more on South Korea from Professor Justin Fendos of Dongsu University.
Just this week, the KCDC, the Korean Center for Disease Control, made a pretty significant announcement saying that the capital city Seoul and the surrounding metropolis have now officially entered this second wave of new infections. As you mentioned earlier, it is important to point out that the number of new infections is still quite low, especially compared to a lot of other countries. So over the last 2 weeks or so, the average per day new cases has been between 30 and 40, whereas in the US it's 20-some thousand, in the UK it's about 1,000. So cases are still pretty low, but definitely it is different from it was 7 or 8 weeks ago, where the new cases were in single digits, on many days 0.
Now, doctors are saying tens of thousands of patients who've had serious COVID-19 infections in the UK will need to be recalled to check whether they've been left with permanent lung damage. Here's more from our health correspondent, Sophie Hutchinson.
Breathless after even a short walk, Tony McHugh, a retired taxi driver, spent 2 weeks on a ventilator with COVID-19. 3 months on, he's still struggling.
Even like having a shower, still exerts you a bit, you know. So I have to sit down when I come out of the shower just for a little bit. See, the silly thing, like now, if I'm just walking the flowers at night or something, and you bend down and you're picking something up and...
As I said, if you do need anything... Most people who've been breathless with the virus are expected to recover, but doctors are concerned about tens of thousands of people who've been seriously ill with what's called COVID-19 pneumonia and whether they have permanent lung damage. This is what healthy lungs look like, nice and black, where they're filled with air. But in stark contrast, these are the lungs of a severely ill COVID-19 patient, and you can see this white haze covering much of them. It's the air sacs filled with fluid, and it's this that doctors are concerned may lead to scarring, permanent damage, which could leave some patients breathless for the rest of their lives.
This is coronavirus because...
This consultant radiologist has seen hundreds of abnormal scans throughout the pandemic. He's been shocked by how badly the virus can affect the lungs and says up to 30% of those he's re-examined could have scarring.
I am concerned about it because of the unusual nature of this infection and how much of both lungs it's affecting. The other thing that's concerning me is the length of time it's seemingly taking based on the x-rays to clear the virus from your lungs. And when you have those two in combination, that is the ideal scenario for scarring.
It's estimated that between 20 to 60% of survivors of other coronaviruses, SARS and MERS, have been left with lung scarring.
At 45 minutes, I have to stop because I can breathe normally.
This clinic in Nottingham is one of a number in the UK that have begun monitoring for lung damage. It follows new guidelines from the British Thoracic Society that patients must be followed up.
And Sophie's report ends this edition of Outside Source. See you tomorrow. Bye-bye.